a woman found dead, a teenage girl in handcuffs, and a father whose presence loomed over everything. The quiet neighborhood of Garden Grove, California, had never seen a crime like this. On March 19, 1985, police responded to a chilling scene: a woman shot in her own bed, lifeless and covered in blood. The victim, Linda Brown, a 23-year-old stepmother whose life had been brutally taken in the dead of night. The person holding the gun, her own 14-year-old stepdaughter, Cinnamon Brown. But this wasn't a case of teenage rebellion gone wrong. This was something far more twisted. The crime scene, something felt off. When police arrived, they found Linda's body lying still, a gunshot wound to her chest. The house was eerily silent. No signs of forced entry, no immediate struggle, just the horrifying aftermath of what seemed like a cold-blooded execution. Then came the real shock. As officers searched the property, they found Cinnamon Brown outside, curled up in a doghouse, covered in vomit. She was shaking, disoriented, mumbling, clutching a note, the words barely legible, "I'm sorry." I had to. To detectives, the case seemed clear-cut: a troubled teenager, a violent outburst, a confession in hand. But something didn't sit right. Cinnamon wasn't acting like a remorseless killer. She seemed lost, confused, drugged even, and one glaring question remained: why would a 14-year-old girl murder her stepmother in cold blood? The father, a man with secrets, David Brown, Cinnamon's father, was devastated, or at least that's how it seemed. He told police he had no idea why his daughter would do something so horrific. He played the role of a grieving widower, perfectly distraught, confused, searching for answers. But detectives couldn't ignore one thing: his story wasn't adding up. David Brown was a man who thrived on control, a smooth talker, a master manipulator. And while Cinnamon sat in a cell, drugged and barely coherent, David was free, too free. A twisted confession or something more? Cinnamon didn't resist arrest. She barely reacted at all. When detectives questioned her, she admitted to the killing, repeating what seemed like a rehearsed story. "I did it. I had to." But when asked why, her answers became fragmented, inconsistent, almost as if she didn't fully understand what had happened herself. She was only 14, no history of violence, no clear motive, and yet she had pulled the trigger. Or had she? Was this really an open and shut case? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? Was Cinnamon really a killer? Or was she just another victim? From the outside, David Brown appeared to be a loving father. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Cinnamon Brown didn't grow up in a home filled with warmth and affection. She grew up under David's control, his words, his rules, his twisted reality. And when he decided that his young wife, Linda Brown, was no longer useful, he turned to the one person who trusted him the most, his daughter. The manipulation begins. David had a way of making people believe his version of the truth. He played the long game slowly, methodically poisoning Cinnamon's mind against Linda. He told her Linda was dangerous, that she hated Cinnamon and wanted to get rid of her. He convinced her that she had to protect the family, that without Linda, everything would be better. He created an environment of absolute loyalty. Cinnamon had no one else, no other family, no friends she could confide in. David isolated her, fed her lies, and nurtured a paranoia that was never hers to begin with. And Cinnamon, she believed him. A plan takes shape. The idea of killing Linda didn't happen overnight. David planted it like a seed, letting it grow inside Cinnamon's young, impressionable mind. First, he talked about how Linda was a problem. Then he wondered aloud what life would be like without her. Finally, he began telling Cinnamon that she was the only one who could fix things. "I need you to do this." The words of a father should be a source of comfort, but in Cinnamon's world, they were a command. The final push, Cinnamon's breaking point. David knew his daughter wouldn't kill on her own. He had to push her, break her down completely. The night before the murder, he played his final move. He told her Linda had to die that night. There was no waiting, no second thoughts. He promised Cinnamon that if she did this, everything would be okay. He gave her the gun. And in that moment, Cinnamon Brown stopped being a child and became a weapon. How did the murder unfold? Did Cinnamon hesitate? Or was she too far gone to stop? The night of the murder, a step, step-by-step breakdown, a single gunshot shattered the silence. A life was taken, and a teenage girl was left holding the weapon. The night of March 19th, 1985 was supposed to be like any other. Linda Brown went to bed, unaware that she wouldn't wake up again. In the shadows of that house, a 14-year-old girl was about to commit a crime she barely understood. But what exactly happened that night? How did Cinnamon Brown, just a child, pull the trigger? And was it truly her decision? Inside the bedroom, Linda's final moments, the air was still. The house was dark. Linda lay asleep, unaware of the footsteps creeping toward her. Cinnamon Brown, shaking, sweating, held a .38 caliber revolver in her hands. David had told her what to do. He had walked her through it. But now, in the moment itself, everything felt unreal. She raised the gun. Her fingers trembled. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. Could she really do this? But then she remembered David's words, "She's the enemy. You have to." And so she pulled the trigger. The fatal shot forensic evidence, the gun went off. The shot hit Linda in the chest. Bullet trajectory analysis showed that she had been shot at close range. The angle of entry suggested that Cinnamon had been standing right beside the bed. Linda woke up from the impact. She gasped, eyes wide in confusion. She was still alive. Did Linda fight back? For a moment there was silence. Linda, still conscious, tried to move. Blood began pooling around her. Her hand reached out, struggling to push herself up. But Cinnamon stood frozen. She didn't fire again. David had told her that one shot would be enough. But he was wrong. Linda was dying but not dead. And she knew what was happening. The aftermath, David's perfect cover-up. Cinnamon panicked. She was in shock. But before she could react, David stepped in. He took the gun from her hands, told her to run. A teenage girl who had been turned into a murderer. But was she truly guilty? Or was she just the weapon in someone else's hands? Meanwhile, David Brown played the role of a devastated widower perfectly. He cried on cue. He told everyone he was heartbroken. He made sure to remind the police that Cinnamon had always been troubled. But when detectives dug deeper, his mask started to slip. David wasn't acting like a grieving husband. In fact, just days after the murder, he was already spending time with another woman. He had a history of manipulating people, bending them to his will. And then came the biggest discovery. He stood to gain nearly $1 million in life insurance from Linda's death. Slowly, the pieces started falling into place. Was Cinnamon really the killer, or was she just the scapegoat? The confession that changed everything as detectives pressed harder, Cinnamon began to break. She stopped repeating her rehearsed lines. She started questioning what had happened. And then, in a quiet, broken voice, she asked a chilling question. Did my dad say he loved me? It was the moment detectives knew this wasn't her crime. This was David Brown's crime. Closing in, the truth begins to unravel. Detectives now had a new mission: prove that David Brown was the true mastermind. They started looking at David's financials. Why was he so eager to move on from Linda's death? They questioned his new girlfriend, who shockingly had her own suspicions about him. And most importantly, they pushed Cinnamon to remember, had she been forced to do this? Bit by bit, the truth was coming to light. Would they have enough evidence to take down David Brown? And would Cinnamon finally realize she had been used? A father's deception, a daughter's tragic role. In a courtroom that would decide their fates, the truth was out. Cinnamon Brown had not acted alone. She had been used, manipulated, turned into a pawn in a sinister game played by the one person she trusted the most, her own father. Now the question was, would David Brown finally face justice? Cinnamon's fate, a second chance. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors had a choice. Should Cinnamon be treated as a murderer or as a victim? She had pulled the trigger. That fact couldn't be denied. But she had been brainwashed. The evidence was undeniable. David had controlled her every thought. After years behind bars, Cinnamon was reevaluated. The legal system now saw her for what she truly was, a victim of psychological abuse. Her sentence was reduced. She was given the chance to rebuild her life. Cinnamon was released from prison, a free woman, but forever haunted by what had happened. David Brown's downfall, the master manipulator exposed. David Brown had spent years weaving lies, convincing everyone he was a grieving husband, an innocent man. But detectives had built an ironclad case against him. His financial records showed his motive, the $1 million insurance payout. His manipulation tactics were revealed in court, shocking the jury. And in a moment of betrayal, one of his former partners turned on him, testifying against him. David Brown was finally convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The man who had once controlled everything now had control over nothing. The aftermath, a lesson in manipulation and control. Cinnamon Brown's story became more than just a crime case. It became a warning about psychological abuse, control, and the terrifying power of manipulation. How many others are trapped in similar situations, unable to see the truth? How many lives have been destroyed by those who wield power over the vulnerable? Cinnamon would never get back the years she lost, but her case sparked discussions about coercion, abuse, and the way the justice system handles victims of manipulation. Final thoughts: was this true justice? David Brown was locked away, but was that enough? Should Cinnamon have been punished at all? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had recognized the signs earlier? And how do we stop this from happening again? What do you think? Was Cinnamon a killer or just another victim? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more in-depth true crime stories, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started.